My granddaughter grabbed my arm and whispered, "Grandpa, leave here now." Her fingers were trembling. Not dramatic, not playful, pure panic. For a second, I didn't understand. The house was full of laughter. Music played softly in the background. My son's 40th birthday party was in full swing. Guests filled the living room, glasses clinking, voices overlapping in forced cheer. "Why?" I asked quietly. She didn't answer. She just tightened her grip and shook her head, eyes wide, glossy with fear. "Please, just trust me." That was all it took. I had spent 40 years reading people. Contractors who lied about timelines. Investors who promised returns that never came. Salesmen who smiled too much. I knew the difference between nerves and terror. This was terror. I stood up slowly, my joints stiff from age, my mind suddenly sharp. Around us, no one noticed. My son was laughing near the kitchen, drink in hand. My daughter-in-law hovered nearby, refilling glasses, smiling too perfectly, too attentive. I felt it then, that quiet instinct every man who survived long enough learns to respect. Danger doesn't always shout. Sometimes it pours you another drink. "I think I'm going to head home," I said calmly. The reaction was immediate. My son stepped toward me too fast. "Dad, already? We're just getting started." My daughter-in-law appeared at my other side. "You haven't even seen the upstairs yet. We've done so much work." Behind them, my granddaughter's grip tightened again. I smiled, the polite smile I'd used in boardrooms for decades. Another time. They exchanged a look, quick, sharp, coordinated. That look told me everything. I reached for my coat. My son tried to laugh it off. My daughter-in-law's voice hardened just a little. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Enough for me. I walked out into the cool night air without turning back. Only when I sat in the taxi did my heart start pounding. As the house disappeared behind us, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not sadness, not anger, betrayal. My phone buzzed in my hand. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I ignored it and stared out the window, watching street lights pass like silent witnesses. 40 years. 40 years of building something real, brick by brick, contract by contract, mistake by mistake. And tonight, inside that house, something had almost been taken from me. I didn't know the full plan yet. I didn't know who else was involved. But I knew one thing with absolute clarity. My granddaughter hadn't saved me from embarrassment. She had saved me from losing everything. And whatever my son and his wife had planned, they had made one fatal mistake. They thought I was old. They thought I was soft. They thought I wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong. I wasn't always the old man everyone thought they could outsmart. There was a time when my back didn't ache in the mornings, when my hands weren't stiff from decades of labor, when sleep came easily because exhaustion did the job for me. For 40 years, I built my construction company from nothing but a borrowed pickup truck, a set of tools, and a reputation I guarded like my life depended on it. Because it did. I worked 12 to 14 hours a day for most of my adult life. Summers under brutal sun. Winters when my breath froze in the air and my fingers went numb around steel beams. I missed birthdays, anniversaries, vacations. I missed a lot of things men regret missing later in life. But I never missed providing. When my son was young, I promised myself he would never have to struggle the way I did. He would have opportunities, safety, a cushion I never had. That promise cost me more than money. The first time I bailed him out, he was 34. full of confidence, convinced he had found his shortcut to success. A Miami real estate project. Glossy brochures, ocean views, guaranteed returns. $75,000. That's how much I wired after he looked me in the eye and told me this was different. I remember signing the transfer at my desk late one evening, telling myself that fathers invest in their children, even when logic says no. 3 months later, the developer vanished. Bankruptcy notices replaced promises. The condos never broke ground. $75,000 gone. I told myself it was a lesson, an expensive one, but necessary. Then came cryptocurrency, $50,000 this time. Mining equipment, online suppliers, videos of warehouses full of humming machines that printed money day and night, according to him. I asked questions. He brushed them off, called me old-fashioned, said I didn't understand modern finance. I sent the money anyway. The equipment never arrived. The website disappeared overnight. So did the supplier. $50,000 gone. By then, I should have stopped. I didn't. Because then came the food truck business, a startup that actually sounded reasonable. Local sourcing, courthouse lunch crowd, steady foot traffic. He even had a partner. I later learned that partner had a conviction for embezzlement. $30,000. 93 days. That's how long it took before the truck, the equipment, and the remaining funds disappeared, along with the partner. By the time I added it all up, I was nearly $200,000 in. $200,000 I could have invested elsewhere, saved, enjoyed in retirement. Instead, I spent it trying to rescue a grown man from his own decisions. And that wasn't even counting the smaller things. The quiet bailouts no one ever mentions, casino debts disguised as temporary loans, credit card payments framed as cash flow issues, $500 here, $1,000 there, just until the next commission check. That phrase became a pattern every time. I told myself this would be the last time. Every time I believed him when he promised he'd learned his lesson. What I didn't see back then was how my help was slowly turning into entitlement. Somewhere along the way, gratitude disappeared, replaced by expectation. I wasn't a father anymore. I was a backup plan. My daughter-in-law made sure of that. She came into his life polished, ambitious, always dressed better than their income justified. She loved expensive wine, designer labels, and talking about success as if proximity to it counted the same as earning it. At first, she thanked me, smiled, complimented my generosity. Then the comments started, subtle ones, about how I was holding him back by being cautious, about how real wealth required bold risks, about how older generations didn't understand modern opportunity. She never said it outright, but the message was clear. What I built slowly wasn't impressive to them. What they wanted was fast, easy, and funded by me. I started noticing how they spoke to me differently. Less respect, less patience, more irritation when I asked questions, more tension when I hesitated. I ignored it, because that's what fathers do when they don't want to admit they're being used. I told myself it was just stress, just ambition, just temporary. I told myself family loyalty was a one-way street, and it was my job to keep giving. That belief nearly destroyed me. By the time the birthday party invitation came, I was already being treated like an obstacle instead of a father. The man who controlled resources they felt entitled to. I didn't know yet how far they were willing to go. But looking back now, Every sacrifice I made laid the foundation for their betrayal. Every bailout taught them I would absorb the consequences. Every check taught them they didn't have to. And every time I chose kindness over boundaries, I trained them to believe I was weak. That night at the party, standing in my son's living room with a drink in my hand, I was surrounded by the evidence of my own mistakes. Luxury I hadn't funded directly. Confidence built on borrowed money. Smiles that hid calculation. I didn't see it clearly until my granddaughter grabbed my arm, but the truth was already there, waiting. I just hadn't been ready to accept it. The change didn't happen all at once. That's what makes betrayal so dangerous. It doesn't arrive screaming. It whispers. It settles in slowly, disguising itself as progress, ambition, growth. At first, it was small things. Phone calls that used to last 20 minutes turned into 5. Family dinners became excuses. Busy week. Big meeting. Next time, Dad. Next time stopped coming. When I did see my son, he was distracted, always checking his phone, always half listening. When I asked about work, his answers were vague, rehearsed. Success without details is usually fiction. I knew that. I chose to ignore it. Then came the tone. Questions I asked out of concern started being met with irritation. Suggestions became interference. Advice became control. "You worry too much," he told me once, not unkindly, but dismissively. "That's why you stayed small." Stayed small? I had spent 40 years keeping hundreds of people employed, paid mortgages, put kids through college, survived recessions that wiped out competitors who chased fast money. But in his world, slow meant irrelevant. My daughter-in-law reinforced it quietly. She never challenged me directly. She didn't have to. She was more effective than that. She'd sigh when I spoke about caution, roll her eyes when I mentioned risk, smile tightly when I questioned timelines or numbers. She spoke in phrases I recognized from consultants who sold illusion instead of substance. High-level strategy, long-term vision, scaling quickly. Nothing concrete, nothing measurable, just language designed to sound impressive. I noticed how she talked about money, not as something earned, but as something accessed, leveraged, unlocked. She treated my resources as if they were already theirs. Not inheritance, not support, entitlement. That word finally formed in my mind the night she asked, "Why do you still control everything?" Not why I had earned it, not how I built it, just why I hadn't handed it over yet. That was the moment I felt something crack. Still, I said nothing. Because confronting decay is harder than confronting disaster. Disaster forces action. Decay invites denial. I told myself they were under pressure, that success would calm them, that once the next deal worked out, gratitude would return. Instead, the demands escalated. The requests became expectations. The expectations became resentment when I hesitated. When I said no, even gently, I felt the shift. The disappointment wasn't financial. It was personal. I was no longer useful in the way they wanted. That's when the disrespect crept in. Comments about my age, about how I didn't understand modern business, about how things worked differently now. They stopped asking for my opinion altogether. I became background noise, an ATM with opinions they didn't want to hear. The worst part wasn't the money. It was realizing that love had been quietly replaced by calculation. I started noticing patterns I'd trained myself to see in contractors who planned to cut corners. Deflection, minimizing risk, avoiding documentation, pressuring for urgency. You have to move fast or you miss the opportunity. That phrase is always a lie. Real opportunity doesn't need panic. I watched my son become someone who blamed others for every failure. Investors, partners, timing, markets, never himself. And every time he failed, he came back to me. Not with humility, with entitlement. I should have drawn the line earlier. Instead, I kept telling myself that family deserved patience. What I didn't realize was that patience without boundaries teaches people they can keep taking. By the time the birthday invitation arrived, the decay was complete. They didn't see me as a father. They saw me as a resource they hadn't extracted yet. They smiled. They invited me. They acted warm. But underneath it all, something cold had taken root. I just didn't know yet how far that coldness was willing to go. The night everything broke started quietly, too quietly. My son stormed into my house just after dinner, not bothering to knock. His confidence felt forced, like a man rehearsing a speech he didn't fully believe in. He talked fast, too fast. Big opportunity, limited window, investors already lined up. I listened without interrupting. That alone seemed to irritate him. When I asked for documentation, his voice sharpened. When I mentioned past failures, his patience snapped. He accused me of holding him back, of sabotaging him with doubt. I told him no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just no. That word hit him harder than any insult could have. He left in a rage, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the empty doorway, feeling something I didn't want to name. That night, I slept poorly. The next morning, I walked outside and saw my car sitting crooked in the driveway. All 4 tires were flat. Not worn, not leaking, destroyed. Each one punctured cleanly, deliberately, with nails placed at the perfect angle to ensure maximum damage. It wasn't random. It wasn't kids. It was professional in its intent. I knew. Still, I wanted to believe I was wrong. I called my son, gave him a chance to deny it honestly. He did. Too smoothly. Concern without surprise is another lie I learned to recognize long ago. The truth came later from a neighbor who had no reason to lie and no stake in the outcome. She'd seen him, watched him circle my car, watched him kneel by each tire, watched him look around before finishing the job. That was the moment denial ended. That was when I understood this wasn't desperation. It was punishment. He wanted to hurt me for saying no. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The birthday party invitation came shortly after. A sudden change in tone, warmth, apologies, family unity, an invitation wrapped in reconciliation. I hesitated. Something felt wrong. But then my granddaughter's name was mentioned. She wanted me there. She missed me. That was the lever they used. I arrived at the party, cautious but hopeful. The house looked different, expensive, renovated, catered. Alcohol flowing freely, too freely. My glass was never empty. Every time I set it down, it was refilled. My daughter-in-law watched carefully, smiling, calculating. My son was nervous, checking his watch, pacing. I didn't know yet why. I found out when my granddaughter grabbed my arm. Her face had gone pale. Her voice shook. "Grandpa, leave here, now." Later in the taxi, she told me everything. The lawyers waiting upstairs, the documents prepared, the plan to get me drunk enough to sign away my company. 40 years of work transferred in one careless moment. They thought age meant confusion. They thought trust meant weakness. They thought family loyalty would blind me. What they didn't expect was the one thing they couldn't control: a conscience. My granddaughter had overheard them planning it, casually, like it was already done, like I was already defeated. That realization hollowed me out. A son I had protected for decades was willing to steal everything from me. A daughter-in-law trained in financial ethics had no problem exploiting an older man for personal gain. This wasn't betrayal born of fear. It was betrayal born of entitlement. They didn't want help. They wanted ownership. They didn't want support. They wanted control. Standing alone in my living room that night, after the truth settled in, I felt something shift permanently. Love didn't disappear, but illusion did. And once illusion dies, clarity takes its place. I didn't yell. I didn't confront them immediately. I did what I had always done when something mattered. I planned. Clarity doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, when denial finally runs out of places to hide. That night, after the party, I sat alone in my living room long after midnight. Every light was on. Not because I needed them, but because darkness suddenly felt like something I didn't trust. My granddaughter's words replayed over and over in my mind. Lawyers upstairs. Documents ready. Alcohol as a weapon. They hadn't panicked. They hadn't rushed. They had planned. That was the moment I stopped asking why they would do this, and started asking how far they had already gone. The first call I made was not to my son. It was to my granddaughter. I needed to hear her voice again, needed to be sure I hadn't imagined the fear in her eyes. She answered immediately. Her voice was steady now, but underneath it was guilt, the kind only good people feel when they expose bad ones. She told me everything she had overheard, the timeline, the certainty, the way my daughter-in-law spoke about me as if I were a problem to solve instead of a person. She told me how they assumed I would be confused, how they joked about how much I had already had to drink, how signing papers would be easy if they framed it as temporary help. Each sentence hardened something inside me. I thanked her, not for loyalty, for courage, because she chose truth over comfort. That mattered. The next morning, before the sun fully rose, another piece fell into place. My neighbor. She had lived next door for decades, watched my son grow up, watched my business trucks come and go, watched my routines become predictable. She told me what she had seen the night my tires were destroyed. Not suspected. Seen. My son walking around my car, kneeling, working carefully, checking for witnesses, methodical. That word stuck with me. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was calculated. And calculation changes everything. By the time she finished speaking, I wasn't shaking anymore. Shock had turned into focus. I finally understood the shape of the situation. This wasn't a family argument. It was an attempted takeover. And it required the same response I had used my entire career when someone tried to cheat me. Documentation, witnesses, patience. I went into my study and opened the filing cabinet I hadn't touched in years. Inside were folders labeled with my son's name. Not memories, evidence. Every failed investment, every bailout, every wire transfer, every contract I had reluctantly signed as a silent partner or rescuer. Dates, amounts, patterns, nearly $200,000 in losses. But more importantly, a clear record of recklessness, and recklessness leaves fingerprints. As I laid everything out on my desk, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel angry. I felt relieved, because for the first time in years, I stopped protecting him from the truth. The truth didn't need my permission to exist. It only needed light. I spent the next few days doing nothing that looked like revenge. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I didn't confront. I observed. I made calls under the guise of catching up. Old colleagues, former partners, people who had invested alongside my son in the past. I didn't accuse. I asked questions. And when questions are asked calmly, people answer honestly. Patterns emerged quickly. Others had lost money too. Others had been reassured with the same language, the same promises, the same urgency. I wasn't the only one. I was just the one who had been protecting him the longest. By the end of the week, I had what I needed. Not leverage, perspective. My son had built nothing. He had only moved money around until it disappeared. And my daughter-in-law, for all her polish, had been complicit, guiding, encouraging, exploiting. They thought they were smarter than me. They confused silence for ignorance. What they didn't understand was that I had spent decades letting people underestimate me. That was my advantage. By the time they realized I was no longer confused, no longer emotional, no longer reactive, it would already be too late. Because I wasn't angry, I was awake. And when a man wakes up after being betrayed, he doesn't rush. He builds consequences the same way he built everything else. Slowly, deliberately, and permanently. Revenge, when done properly, is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or raise voices. It moves in silence, guided by facts instead of feelings. That's how I approached it. Every morning for a week, I followed the same routine. Coffee at dawn. Legal pad on the kitchen table. My study door closed before the rest of the neighborhood stirred awake. No one would have guessed what I was building. I started with paper. 40 years in business had taught me that memory is unreliable, but documentation never lies. I organized everything chronologically. Wire transfers, contracts, emails, text messages, bank statements, notes from conversations I'd written down years ago without realizing how valuable they would become. Patterns emerged quickly. Every investment my son pitched followed the same structure: urgency, promised returns, vague explanations, pressure to act before I could verify. And every failure ended the same way. Blame shifted outward. Partners failed him. Markets betrayed him. Timing was unfair. Never once did responsibility land where it belonged. I made copies of everything, not because I planned to confront him, because truth spreads faster when it's shared. I reached out to people I trusted under neutral pretenses. Old business associates, investors who had once asked my opinion about my son's ventures. I didn't warn them. I didn't accuse. I simply asked how things had turned out. The answers were consistent. Losses, confusion, silence after money changed hands. One man admitted he'd stopped sleeping for months after losing his retirement savings. Another said he felt ashamed for trusting family connections instead of doing his own due diligence. That was when I understood something important. My silence hadn't just enabled my son, it had harmed others, and that gave me clarity. This wasn't about personal betrayal anymore. This was about accountability. I assembled information packets with the same care I used to prepare bids for major contracts. Clear, factual, undeniable. No opinions, just records. Each packet contained timelines, amounts, and documented communication. Enough for anyone with basic financial literacy to see the truth without interpretation. I didn't send them myself. I used professional courier services. Anonymous delivery. No return address. Truth doesn't need a signature. By the time the first envelope reached its destination, my son still thought he was in control. He called me twice that week, friendly, casual, asking if I'd like to get lunch, floating new ideas. I answered politely, briefly. I gave nothing away. Meanwhile, the trap closed. I watched quietly as phone calls between investors began to multiply. One question led to another. One comparison revealed a pattern no one could unsee. Trust evaporates quickly when people realize they weren't unlucky. They were targeted. I moved on to the next layer, my daughter-in-law. She was careful, more careful than my son. But careful people leave cleaner trails, not invisible ones. Her professional life depended on credibility, ethics, trust. And she had crossed a line. I documented the birthday party expenses, the alcohol, the catering, the sudden renovations that didn't align with their claimed financial stress. I paired that with what my granddaughter had overheard, the plan, the intent, the method. It painted a picture no ethics committee could ignore. Again, no confrontation. Another anonymous packet, another courier, another quiet delivery. I never followed up. I didn't need to. Systems work when you let them. By the end of that week, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a young man bidding on my first major contract. Control. Not over people, over outcomes. I wasn't destroying them. I was removing the cover they hid behind. If their lives collapsed after that, it would be because they had built them on deception, not because I pushed. The final step was the hardest. I changed nothing outwardly. I didn't cut them off suddenly. I didn't announce consequences. I waited. Because when people believe they are still winning, they expose themselves further. And I knew one thing with absolute certainty. They would come to me. They always did. Arrogance has a sound. It's the sound of people laughing too loudly when they think they've won. In the days after I set everything in motion, my son's confidence returned. He called again, cheerful this time, relaxed, almost smug. He talked about new momentum, about how things were finally turning around, about how some people who had doubted him before were suddenly out of the picture. I listened. I always listened. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. No idea that old investors were comparing notes. No idea that reputations take decades to build and minutes to destroy once truth enters the room. My daughter-in-law was even bolder. She stopped pretending to be polite. When we spoke briefly on the phone, her tone carried a thin layer of superiority, the kind that comes from believing consequences are for other people. She hinted that maybe I should think about simplifying my life, that maybe it was time to let go and stop controlling things. Control, that word again. They thought silence meant submission. They mistook my calm for fear. Meanwhile, they continued spending. More renovations, more dinners out, more social appearances meant to project success. The kind of performance people put on when they are trying to convince themselves as much as others. My son posted photos online, smiling, toasting, hashtags about growth and vision. I recognized it immediately. This was hubris, the dangerous kind, the kind that makes people careless. They stopped watching their steps, stopped checking their stories for consistency, stopped worrying about who might be listening. They assumed they were untouchable. I saw it the way I'd seen contractors overspend before a project collapsed, the way they upgraded trucks before cash flow stabilized, the way they celebrated imaginary profits. Overconfidence always comes right before the fall. They spoke about me differently now, not with anger, with dismissal. I was the old man who didn't get it, the obstacle they had nearly removed, the problem they assumed would resolve itself once pressure increased. They didn't realize the pressure had already shifted, away from me, onto them. My son even joked once, "You'll thank me someday for pushing you to loosen up." I smiled and said nothing. Inside, I was counting. Every lie they told themselves added weight to what was coming. Every careless word made the collapse cleaner. They were too busy feeling powerful to notice the phone calls that stopped coming, the meetings that never got scheduled, the invitations that quietly disappeared. They blamed timing. They blamed markets. They blamed bad luck. They never blamed themselves. That's the thing about entitled people. They believe success is owed to them and failure is inflicted on them. By the time the first cracks became visible, it was already too late. Because hubris doesn't allow course correction. It only accelerates. And they were about to learn that confidence built on deception collapses faster than fear ever could. The first call didn't come from my son. It came from someone who used to believe in him. I was sitting at my kitchen table early Monday morning, coffee untouched, watching sunlight crawl slowly across the floor. The phone rang once, then stopped, then rang again. When I answered, the voice on the other end was cautious, controlled. The voice of a man who had just discovered something he wished he hadn't. "I don't know how to ask this," he said, "but were you aware your son pitched the same investment to 3 different people, using different numbers?" I didn't answer immediately. I didn't need to. That pause told him everything. By noon, the calls multiplied. Former partners, investors, people who had once shaken my hand and told me how much they trusted my judgment because my son carried my name. They weren't angry at first. They were confused, then embarrassed, then furious. They compared notes, contracts, emails, promises. Timelines overlapped in ways that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. What looked like individual failures now revealed a pattern, a system, my son's system. By Tuesday, the word had spread beyond those directly affected. Business circles are small, especially when money disappears. Meetings were canceled, calls went unanswered, invitations dried up, doors closed without explanation. That's how professional consequences work, quietly, efficiently, permanently. My son noticed the change before he understood it. He called me late that afternoon, irritation creeping into his voice. "Something weird is happening," he said. "People aren't returning calls. Deals are stalling." I kept my voice neutral. "Markets change." He laughed nervously. "Yeah, but not like this." Silence stretched between us. He didn't ask directly. He didn't dare. By Wednesday, panic replaced confusion. I heard it in his breathing when he called again, faster, shallow. "Dad, did you talk to anyone about my past deals?" There it was, the question he had been avoiding. "I answered questions when they were asked," I said. "I didn't lie. "You didn't have to volunteer information," he snapped. "No," I replied calmly. "I didn't." That was the moment he realized something irreversible had begun. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law's world was unraveling just as efficiently. She came home one afternoon to find a message from her employer waiting, a formal request. Documentation needed, an internal review triggered by an anonymous ethics complaint. She tried to act calm. She failed. I could hear the tension in her voice when she called. Tight, sharp, controlled only by effort. "Someone is trying to ruin us," she said. I let the silence do the work. "They're questioning my judgment," she continued. "My integrity." Integrity. The word landed heavy. I thought of the documents upstairs, the wine refilled too quickly, the lawyers waiting like vultures. "Integrity matters," I said simply. She hung up. By the end of the week, the hammer had fallen. Not dramatically, not publicly, but thoroughly. My son's professional credibility was gone. No announcements, no accusations, just an absence where opportunity used to be. My daughter-in-law was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Her access revoked, her authority suspended. They came to my house together that Friday evening, not angry, desperate. The confidence was gone, the arrogance stripped away. My son couldn't meet my eyes. My daughter-in-law tried once more to control the narrative, to explain, to justify. I listened. Then I said the only thing that mattered. This is what accountability looks like. They had tried to take everything from me in one night. Instead, they lost everything slowly. And this was only the beginning. Collapse doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in waves, each one stripping away another illusion. When my son and his wife sat across from me that night, they still believed there was room to negotiate, that consequences could be bargained with, that family status might soften the outcome. They were wrong. My son spoke first. His voice was raw, unfiltered panic barely disguised as anger. "You didn't have to do this," he said. "You could have handled it privately." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands the way I had in hundreds of contract disputes over the years. "Privately," I repeated. "Like puncturing my tires in the dark? Like preparing legal documents upstairs while getting me drunk downstairs?" He flinched. My daughter-in-law tried a different approach. Calm, reasonable, strategic. "Glenn, this has spiraled out of control. My career is at risk. Your son's reputation is destroyed. Surely this isn't what you wanted." I met her eyes. "No," I said. "What I wanted was not to be betrayed. What I'm seeing now is simply the result." They began unraveling after that. My son stood up, pacing, running his hands through his hair. The confident man who once lectured me about modern business now looked like a teenager caught stealing. "Everyone's turned their back on me," he said. "Investors won't even take my calls." I nodded once. That's what happens when trust is gone. He stopped pacing and faced me. His voice cracked. "I needed that money. You know I did." I stood then, slowly, deliberately. "And I needed a son who understood responsibility instead of entitlement," I said. But here we are. My daughter-in-law lost her composure completely. "You're enjoying this," she snapped. "You're punishing us." I shook my head. "No, I'm not punishing you. I'm no longer protecting you." That was when the begging started. Not apologies, requests. "Help me talk to them. Call your contacts. Explain it was a misunderstanding." I listened to every word without interrupting. Then I opened the folder on the table between us. Inside were copies of everything: investment records, wire transfers, email chains, witness statements, the evidence of a lifetime of irresponsibility laid bare. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said quietly. "This is a pattern." Silence filled the room. They had nothing left to argue, no story to spin, no angle to play. The final blow came not from me, but from reality. My son's phone rang while we sat there. He answered it without looking at the screen. Within seconds, his face collapsed. Another creditor, another demand, another door closing. He lowered the phone slowly, hands shaking. "It's over," he whispered. I nodded. "Yes, it is." I walked to the front door and opened it. They hesitated, waiting for mercy. I gave them clarity instead. "You will not receive another dollar from me," I said. "Not now, not later. Consider it a permanent financial cutoff." The words landed harder than any shout ever could. They left without another word. I stood alone in my living room afterward, listening to the silence settle. No satisfaction, no joy. Only the calm that comes when chaos finally ends. They had chosen betrayal. They were now living with its consequences. Peace didn't arrive with celebration. It arrived with quiet mornings and uninterrupted sleep. For the first time in years, I woke up without checking my phone, without bracing myself for another crisis disguised as a family emergency. My house felt different. Not emptier, lighter. I returned to my routines: early walks, black coffee, time in my study without stacks of unpaid favors weighing on my desk. My business remained intact, protected, clean. I met with my attorney and updated my will, not out of anger, but clarity. Inheritance is not a reward for proximity. It's a responsibility reserved for those who understand its weight. My granddaughter was named executor of the values, if not the money. She earned that. I helped her with college, quietly, transparently, with boundaries. She asked questions. She learned. She listened. That alone told me everything I needed to know. As for my son, the distance became permanent. Not dramatic, not hostile, just real. He stopped calling once he understood there would be no more bailouts, no more safety nets, no more rescues from consequences he created himself. Regret showed up in his voice once, months later. Not regret for what he did to me, regret for what it cost him. That distinction mattered. My daughter-in-law vanished from my life entirely. Her career never recovered. Trust, once broken at that level, rarely does. I didn't celebrate their downfall. I accepted it, because this wasn't revenge. This was karma. Financial karma doesn't scream. It balances. It takes what was taken and restores equilibrium. I learned something in all of this that I wish I had learned earlier. Kindness without boundaries is weakness. Love without accountability is enablement. And family loyalty that only flows in one direction isn't loyalty at all. It's exploitation. I am not bitter. I am free. Free from manipulation. Free from guilt. Free from the illusion that sacrifice alone earns respect. Respect is built the same way everything else is built, with effort, with integrity, with consequences. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt taken advantage of by the people you sacrificed the most for, know this: It's never too late to draw a line. It's never too late to protect what you built. And it's never wrong to demand respect, even from family. Sometimes, especially from family.